So, as Sarah mentioned, I mean, what I was interested in doing, I started out because I was obsessed with people who fake their own death. And I had been collecting little stories of people who fake their deaths over the years, and I was trying to find out some way to do a longer story on one of these people. And I finally got Wired Magazine to agree to let me do a story, and it was centered around a guy from Arkansas who built up a lot of debt on his corporate credit card, and then he decided to fake drown himself and go start a new life. So it's sort of about how he got caught, and in the process of that, looking at all these other people who had gotten caught, and many of them are really kind of hilariously, bad at disappearing. And they always do something that in the end you say, I can't believe that they did that. I mean, there was one guy who, he lived in Indianapolis and he tried to fly a plane. He was going to jump out of the plane and it was going to crash in the Gulf of Mexico, and he was a pilot. And so he went through this whole process, he set it all up, and then he flew over Alabama. He radioed the tower just as he planned, said, my windshield exploded, I'm going to have to jump out of the plane. Or actually, he didn't say I'm going to have to jump out of the plane, he just said, my windshield exploded, I think I'm going down. And then he parachuted out of the plane, and unfortunately for him, they scrambled fighter jets to go examine this plane, which had stopped responding, and there was no one in it. And then he also had failed to put enough gas in the plane, so the plane actually crashed, not in the Gulf of Mexico, but in Florida, on the ground, and there was no body in it. But what interested me even more than that was that then they finally caught him, and he went to trial, and one of the things, he actually didn't go to trial, he had to plead guilty because one of the pieces of evidence they had against him was they had confiscated his laptop. And on his laptop were Google searches for how to jump out of a plane at X number of feet. Google searches for all of the places he had planned to go, for moving money into different bank accounts. So he had basically left a roadmap of everything that he wanted to do on his computer without even realizing that he'd done so. So as I was collecting these stories and doing this, I sort of got together with my editor and we started thinking the real way to get at the heart of how difficult this is, because you always say, oh, why did they make that mistake, would be for me to actually try to do it. So the parameters we set up were that I would try to disappear for a month, that I wouldn't actually try to go off the grid. I wouldn't go live in a tent in a national park because for a month it'd be pretty difficult for someone to find me. Now over a longer period of time, even that you could be found. But so I would actually try to adopt an entirely new identity, and I would try to use all of the technologies that I use now, including social networking, which I do. I am a participant in, but as a new person. So I'd actually try to create a new identity and then jump into that identity and leave my old one behind. And then people could win $5,000 if they found me in person, took my picture, and said a code word, which was fluke, which was a reference to the guy from Arkansas who disappeared and took his dog with him, this dog named Fluke. He was discovered 8 months later with his dog and his wife and his kid. So those were kind of the general parameters. I would try not to break the law, just so we would avoid any legal trouble when I got back. And then, other than that, we just sort of threw it open to whatever people would try to do. Now, we had to make it a little bit easier for the general public because if an investigator was looking for you, they would have subpoenas, they could get access to your bank accounts, your email potentially. So instead, we would just release all of that. So my editor had passwords to everything, every part of my life. So frequent flyer accounts, bank accounts, credit cards, and he could reveal anything that he wanted to out of those. My phone records, who I'd called for the last month. So that's how we set it off. And then I took off from San Francisco, but actually before that, so what I had to do was I had to try to figure out what this new identity was going to be like and how could I sever it from my old identity. So I adopted a new name, which was James Gatz, James Donald Gatz. Donald is actually my middle name, which was one of the kind of mistakes I made. It didn't end up costing me, but when people try to disappear, oftentimes they carry something over from their previous life. And that's the way they end up getting caught. They use the same birth date or they'll transpose the numbers in their birth date or in their social security number. So using my middle name was a bad idea, but I adopted a new name. Part of the reason I adopted James Gatz is that it's a name that in The Great Gatsby, it's actually The Great Gatsby's original name before he changes it to Jay Gatsby. But it had a practical purpose too, which was if somebody Googled me, if I met someone and I told them my name and they Googled me, in the digital age, there's a little bit of an issue. If you have no presence online in a certain community of people, you are suspicious. And you'll read stories about people who go on dates, and the first thing they do when they go home from the date is they Google the person. So I wanted to have a reasonable excuse for why if someone Googled me, they couldn't find anything, because all they would find would be references to The Great Gatsby. So then I tried to develop these aspects of my identity, ways of using money. So these are gift cards that you pay cash for, and they're completely anonymous. And then you can register them online under a fake name, and then I used those cards to order another card online, which actually had my name on it. And it looks kind of like a credit card. I got the patriotic flag-waving one, and it says gift card in the corner, but most places, if I went and used it, they would treat it almost like a piece of ID. I had business cards, which were references to a company that I started called Bespect. Bespect Research, which I always describe as it's like respect with a B, which also doesn't mean anything. And then I mocked up a fake ID. Whoops, we lost our... We unplugged. There we go. Well, I had a fake ID. You may have seen it. It was actually like a university ID. I called myself a visiting scholar because creating a regular driver's license or passport would get me into legal problems. So I mostly tried to sort of stay within the parameters of this low-level ID. And then I would often tell a story that I had lost my driver's license, but I had this scholar's ID, and I had this credit card, and was that enough to get me by? And at most hotels, at most places where they kind of routinely ask for driver's license for no apparent reason, that was enough.
Do we need to do something?
Is this going to come back?
Oh. Okay.
So then I had, the company that I had was actually registered in the state of New Mexico. It's a real company. It's called Bespect LLC. It's still registered. It's not registered to my name. And then I also wanted to separate everything from my old life to my new life. So I rented an office under a fake name. And then I had all my mail under my fake name show up at that office, including this gift card I had it sent there. Because any mail that I had sent to my own address with the fake name creates a connection in a database somewhere between these two identities. So here you can see the website for my company. It had some fake projects that I had whole backstories for. I had a whole reason why I was sort of traveling around the country. I had a fake Twitter account, but this was me talking about my daily business as I went on this trip around the country. And at different points, I would make it public or make it private, depending on how paranoid I was that someone was following it. Sometimes I would seed it with false information if I thought people were paying attention to it. This is my Facebook page. And this was interesting because, if you or I sign up for Facebook, the way it usually works is somebody says, oh, you should sign up for Facebook. And then you connect with them, and then they know some of your friends, and you connect with them, and then pretty soon you have a network of your friends. You send them some invitations, maybe your family as well. But I was, as James Gatz, I didn't have any friends. I didn't know anyone, and I didn't want to connect with anyone that I knew. So it created this dilemma of how do I manufacture friends out of nothing, and it turns out there are people on Facebook who will friend anyone. And most of them are multi-level marketing gurus and real estate people. So I would find people who had 900, 1,000, 2,000 friends, and I would send them requests. And pretty soon I built up a pretty good collection of friends. A lot of these are from after, but I had 30, 40 friends, none of whom I actually knew, none of whom knew me. But if someone looked me up, and oftentimes I would say, oh, look me up on Facebook. And it created this perception that I was a real person. Like, who would concoct this entire identity with business cards? And it just gave an authenticity. So it was kind of looking at both sides of this question, that people could use my old information to track me, but I could also use the whole idea of digital identity to develop this new person who would have a backstory because he existed online. So then I'll just go through this quickly because it gets a little technical, but basically the one big problem I had is I was staying online. I had to show that I was online, so I would log into my email every day, my real email. And if any of you use Gmail, you may or may not have ever noticed, but in a tiny, tiny font at the bottom of the screen, it says last logged in from, and it has your IP address. And actually, if you click further, it has your last 5 IP addresses. It's basically recording every computer that you've logged in from. And your computer has an IP address when it attaches to the internet, and that IP address correlates to your physical location. And I'll talk about it in a little minute, but you can use the IP address to locate not just someone where someone is generally, but their specific address. So I had to do something to conceal my IP address to show that I wasn't where I was in terms of the IP address. So I used something called Tor, which is a piece of software that it's designed for whistleblowers and dissidents to use so they can mask where information is coming from. It's been in the news a lot lately. If you follow the news about WikiLeaks, this website, they have a lot of interaction with Tor. So basically, Tor masks how you access the internet. So if I'm Alice, I'm trying to get something off of Bob's web server, Tor makes it look like I'm jumping from that last computer to Bob's server. And basically, all these hops in between are anonymous. So if Bob is there and he's saying, oh, who's accessing my server, it might look like it was coming from Germany, when in fact I was in Los Angeles. But then I had a friend who worked at Google who said, you know what, Tor can be cracked. Anything can be cracked. So that's not safe enough. So instead what I did was I took these 2 computers and I left them in an anonymous office that I rented in Las Vegas, which is this windowless room. And I set the computers up, I attached them to the internet. I rented the office for the entire month. And then what I did when I wanted to access the internet was I actually remotely logged into these computers. I used these computers to access the internet. And then if someone ever traced my IP back, they would only get as far as Las Vegas. And in fact, later on they did. So I set off around the country. I started in San Francisco. I drove to Vegas. I set up my computers. Then I sold my car. I started taking other forms of transportation. I went to LA. And then I got online and hitched a ride with a band, a small indie band who was touring across the country. So I went from LA and they kind of cruised across Texas, and I was sort of just riding along in their van, helping them pay for gas, and basically they kind of left me alone. And then I ended up, this map is actually made by someone who was chasing me. It's not entirely accurate, but essentially I went to St. Louis with the band. I took a train down to New Orleans, and then I rented an office in New Orleans, and I rented it under a fake name. I signed a lease. And I would do things like I had anonymous PayPal accounts, or not anonymous, but attached to my fake name. And I would contact the landlord over the internet and ask them if they took PayPal. So sometimes I rent an apartment for a week, and I never even saw the landlord. He just left me a key in a box. I paid him with PayPal. As far as he knew, I was James Gatz, and as long as I paid the bill, he didn't care. So then the other dilemma I had was my pictures were in the magazine, and not only in the magazine, but every day Wired was publishing more and more pictures. I had given them essentially a dossier of information about me, the same kind of thing that an investigator would uncover if they spent some time interviewing my family and things like that. So I had to kind of disguise my physical appearance because I didn't know if anyone I had encountered along the way might have seen the magazine, and anyone could catch me. So all they had to do was have seen the magazine, know the code word, and take my picture. So I wanted to do a little bit to mask my physical appearance. So at first I grew out this kind of like scraggly beard. This is the first day. Then I shifted towards, this is my Las Vegas look. So these are fake glasses, and I dyed my hair, and I dyed the goatee as well. And I kind of slicked it back. And I had, this is from the end, and it's you can't see it that well, but I had, 4 pairs of fake glasses, sunglasses. I had multiple different kinds of contacts, hats, all this stuff I was kind of carrying with me, along with, enough digital gear to kind of stock a Radio Shack, basically. I had throwaway phones. I had different ways to access the internet, and all this stuff I was sort of carrying along with me. So then, here I am in Los Angeles, And I actually got into a man on the street video. And at the time, swine flu there was a big swine flu scare. And there's a woman who does an online news report who was going around Venice Beach asking people, what do you think about swine flu? And I thought, well, this will be a really funny thing for me to get into. And then later I can say, see, I wasn't hiding out from the world. Here I was. I was on Venice Beach. Not only that, but I was in this video, and this video was published online, and she has a lot of fans. I was out there to be found. So then, this is me in New Orleans. I've got my hat. I've washed out the dye by this point. And then, I started building up a lot of paranoia, even starting in LA. In fact, one of the things that's in the final story is that I actually ran from a helicopter one day on Venice Beach because I had used my ATM card to deposit the check from my selling the car, because this was like a cashier's check, and I didn't want to lose it. I mean, it was $3,000, which is not something you want to just not be careful with. So I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and deposit this. I was leaving LA anyway. I don't care if they know that I've used this ATM. But then I couldn't get out as quickly as I wanted to. I couldn't get my ride out of LA. So basically, one morning I was out on the beach. There was a helicopter. It was kind of hovering over me. And I thought, well, that's weird. And then I kind of moved down the beach, and it kind of moved down the beach. And I thought, well, there's nothing else going on this beach. It was 6 in the morning. I was out for a jog. There were a few surfers out. And then I thought, you know what? Someone has seen this ATM thing. They've posted it online, and they've gotten a friend who has a helicopter. And they're coming out to get me, because for $5,000, you pay the friend a few hundred for using the helicopter, and you're still making good money. So I started running. And then the helicopter really started following me, because there's this guy on the beach probably sprinting as fast as he can across the beach, and that's really something you want to check out. So I actually ran from this helicopter and then ran up and down all these streets and then got out of LA that day. So anyway, long story short, I was paranoid through a lot of this. So I decided to go with more extreme disguises, which was this. So I shaved the top of my head. I went with the mustache, and you can see I'm wearing the colored contacts, so I have blue eyes, and my eyes are brown in that. And this was my kind of businessman look, and I used this especially. I took one flight. I took 2 flights, but I flew one place, and I had to use my real ID because I didn't want to mess with using a fake ID, obviously, on airplanes post 9/11. So I went with this kind of businessman. I wore a tie, and at the airport, the only person who's going to look at my ID was going to be the TSA person. And if you've flown at all, the TSA people don't actually pay that close attention to the photo on your driver's license. So I made it through with this disguise. So that's all the stuff that I was doing. And then the question is, what was everyone else doing? What were the people trying to find me doing? And the first thing they did was they kind of spontaneously organized online. They created these organic communities of people who were looking for me. So this is the Facebook page that they created, I think, on the first day. And after about 24 hours, there were 1,000 members of this Facebook group. And what they were trying to do was develop ways to coordinate, because they had a problem in that even if they knew where I was, unless they wanted to lay out money to come find me, if I wasn't close to them, it was going to be very difficult to find me, because I could be anywhere in the country. But if they collaborated, then if one person had the information about where I was, they could contact someone who was closer to where I was and give it a shot. And that's what they were doing. People one guy took off in the middle of the night and drove all the way to Vegas from San Diego when there were signs that I might be in Vegas, and missed me actually by a couple of days. So then they also got on Twitter, and this was kind of the hub of where they were exchanging information back and forth, whether it was things that were put out by Wired, things that were from my accounts, or things that they discovered online. So by the end of the day, on the first day, they're digging into everything they could find about me online. They're also digging into databases that some people have access to, like LexisNexis and ChoicePoint. So by the end of, I think, 24, 36 hours, every address that I'd ever lived at was published online. Someone had already found them all and put them all out there. And I had moved a lot of times, so this was a dozen addresses that were all there. And then they made wanted posters, which they would put up in places where they thought that I might be going. One of the things that was part of the information that Wired put out about me was that I have something called celiac disease, which means that I have to eat a gluten-free diet. And so these were all over gluten-free cafes in Seattle and restaurants that catered to gluten-free people. And even when the morning that I ran from the helicopter, when they eventually did discover I was in LA, they went out to several restaurants that they thought I might be located at and actually scoured those restaurants looking for me. So this is a map that someone made of points of interest, of places. It's got every address I lived at on there. It's got, I think it's got my family's address on there. It's got some work-related stuff. But one thing that interests me is if you look at the bottom, I don't know if you can read it, but it has call car collision, and Lily's pet care, which are actually things that people found out that I had reviewed online. So I'd gone on this website called Yelp, and thinking that it was pseudo-anonymous, I had actually reviewed, not really even thinking about the consequences of it or anything. I just reviewed the person who cat sits my cat. And this woman got dozens of calls from people who had gone and found that that's what I had reviewed. Now, I'm not a big reviewer of online things, but if you think about it, if you were, and then you disappeared, you've actually left an entire map of the things you like and don't like, which would be an incredibly valuable tool for an investigator. And then this is actually like a network diagram that someone made of both the IP addresses, which are at the very bottom, and again, this is very early on, and it's got credit card expenses on there. And then they did things like not just looking online, doing searches, which they were incredibly good at, but there were also investigators, informative investigators who were involved. And they used very tried and true investigative techniques, which were just calling people over and over again. So if they wanted to find out a piece of information, and they were supposed to, by the rules of the contest, not break the law as well, they would just call and ask for it. So if they wanted to know about a FedEx package that was on my credit card, they would just call FedEx and say, I want to know where this package was sent to or from. And the FedEx person would say, well, are you this person? And they would say no. And they would say, well, I can't tell you that. They would hang up, they would call, and they would get the next person. And they would ask the same questions. But eventually they would find some person who answered the phone who would just give it to them, which is really perfectly legal. And they did the same thing with my IP addresses. I mentioned I had this office in Las Vegas. I had the computers in it. Eventually, they found out the IP address for that office, but an IP address only correlates to a few city blocks, and so you need to get access to the actual internet service provider in order to find out where the specific address is. And a kid from Portland, a 17-year-old kid who got really obsessed with trying to find me, he started calling that internet service provider, and eventually a technician said, "Oh yeah, that's 2465 South Pecos Road," and then they had my address. Now, fortunately, I had a contingency plan for that. But it just goes to show that it's not actually, when I started out, I thought the issue was all the information that we put out online, which is true, which is an issue, when it comes to privacy. But, if you're actually worried about the information that corporations have and how they use it, they're not keeping quite as tight tabs on it as you might expect. And then the last thing I'll show is this is my cat. And the reason I was showing this is that, so this is posted on Flickr, public photo site. I have a page on Flickr where I post pictures of my cat and other things. But what someone did was they actually took the pictures on Flickr and they stripped out the information about the camera that they were taken with. And then they created a little program, a little piece of software that had an algorithm that essentially scoured Flickr looking for other pictures taken with that camera. The idea being that if I was out there with this same camera, taking pictures and posting them anonymously, then they could turn up my location by finding pictures. Fortunately, I didn't actually take that camera with me. So, but you'll see even the name of the camera is actually taken with. There it is right there. So then I was settled in New Orleans. I had this apartment rented. I was paranoid, but I was feeling pretty good about how I was doing. I was getting up to day 20, day 23, day 25. Meanwhile, there was one guy, his name is Jeff Reifman, he lives in Seattle. He used to work at Microsoft, and he now has this thing where he builds Facebook applications. They're like web pages within Facebook. And the purpose of these is actually to organize people around news. And he read the story, and he saw the disappearance contest. And he said, well, this is a good way to attract attention for my new venture. So he created this thing called Vanish Team. So he built this, it lives inside of Facebook, and it had all kinds of information about my disappearance. And it has a map, and people annotated the map, and people were exchanging clues. But after a while, people stopped coming to it a little bit, and he wasn't getting anywhere, and he kept having these theories about where I was, and they weren't correct. But then he decided he could do something else with it, which is he could lure me to this page and then try to capture my IP address when I visited the page. And the way he did that was he added this code, and this code right here, all it does is, if someone visits his Facebook page, they have to be logged into Facebook. When they are, it captures their IP address and their Facebook profile. So here he has this list, everybody that's visited my page, which was hundreds of people a day, but he could sort them. So he could say, all right, give me all of the people who have less than 30 friends. That's what he did at the beginning, and he figured, if this guy's got a fake Facebook page, he can't have that many friends. So I had outwitted him at first. I had 30 or 40, and he didn't find me in the first couple of days. And then he bumped it up to 50, and he looked through every single person visiting his page that had less than 50 friends, and then he came across this, which is my page, which he recognized because I had been in that Man on the Street video, and since then I hadn't changed my photograph. So then he knows, this is me. He knows when I'm visiting his Facebook application, and then he knows my IP address because he has that piece of code that captures it, which I think technically at the time was against Facebook's terms of service for him to even do that. But he had an advantage, which is that I didn't actually know that he could do that. I didn't know that he could build something inside Facebook without their permission to capture IP addresses. So that, in combination with the fact that I was getting a little bit lazy after 25 days because the method that I'd set up to access the internet anonymously took forever. So it was incredibly slow. So I started paring down the number of websites I visited using my anonymous methods. So then I hit his page, he gets my IP address, he starts following me around, and then I'll sort of condense the end of the story, but he had a problem, which is that he had to find people on the ground to capture me, because I was in New Orleans, he was in Seattle, and he used this piece of information that had come out that I have celiac disease, that I eat a gluten-free diet, and he contacted the only gluten-free pizzeria in all of New Orleans. There's one. It's called Naked Pizza. And he knew that I would probably end up eating there, which was true, but they actually did it one better, which is that Naked Pizza got so into catching me that they gave my photo to all of their delivery people, all of their employees, and then they scoured the city looking for me. And so
how did they know you like pizza?
I think that came out too. I think that came out in an interview that they did with a friend of mine that sort of pointed to my sort of low-grade eating habits.
Oh, wait, no, I remember they actually, with an IP capture, realized that you had visited the site.
Yeah, that's right. He also knew that I had visited the website. Right. Because once he contacted them, then they were also looking for my IP address. They made the comparison. So long story short, I think I'm New Orleans local. I think I'm all set. I've got 5 days to go, and I ride my bicycle up to a bookstore, and these guys are waiting outside. And they snap my photo, and they actually say, do you know some guy named Fluke? Which is close enough to the code word that they've captured me. And actually, I think the funny thing about this photo is that I'm still wearing my fake wedding ring, which was part of my disguise. I don't know why I deem that to be a proper disguise. But I don't know.
Well, you'd also shaved your head.
I had shaved my head. So that day, right before I rode over, actually, I had gone to my final disguise, which was shaving off the rest of my hair. And going bald, and then I was going to go to wigs after that, but I never got there. So that was basically it, and people always ask me, did I prove one way or the other, did it prove that it's impossible to disappear in America, or, do I think that someone could really do it? And, obviously, how hard it is to disappear is entirely a function of how hard people are looking for you. And there were a lot of smart people who were looking for me. But I think it did illustrate a couple of things, one of which is about the information that you put out about yourself is actually the information that's the greatest, threat, or you may not view it as a threat. But when it comes to privacy, most of the information that you would worry about is actually the information that you're revealing. And almost everything that people used was information that I had voluntarily put out about myself. The fact that corporations collect data about me is an issue, but when it comes to this actual real-world situation, that stuff wasn't the stuff that I had to worry about. The stuff I had to worry about was the stuff that I had put out. And then the other thing is the way that people, there was sort of this hive mind quality to it all, that, you know, people acting individually couldn't kind of paint the picture of me that people acting collectively could. And even in the end, you know, Jeff Reithman used this sort of supreme individual effort to figure out my IP address, but he could only catch me through collaboration. So it's kind of an interesting experiment in how that works. And subsequent to that, the Department of Defense actually replicated this in a way they put weather balloons all around the country, and they ran this contest to see if anyone could identify who most quickly could identify where all the weather balloons were, and who could form teams to find them. And it followed much the same structure as this. So that was the experiment. And how you want to chat?
What were you going to do? I mean, how was it? Were you just going to lay low in New Orleans and try and ride it out?
No, I had already bought a plane ticket actually to New York. I wanted to finish in New York because that's where Wired's parent company, which is called Condé Nast, is based in Times Square in New York. And I wanted to infiltrate the Condé Nast building. And I had already mocked up a fake badge. I had visited the building before I left and gotten one of their badges, and I had photoshopped it, and I had it with my shaved head. I had added the picture, so I was ready to go. But they also were ready for me in New York, and they apparently had funded some 10,000 or 20,000 flyers that they were going to leave at every Kinko's in the city, and anyone could come in and put them up. So they wanted to have this sort of dramatic finale of people chasing me all over New York City, but it wasn't to be.
But it didn't work. Yeah, it's funny because we met actually before. I think I knew about the piece, but I'd thought about it in the context of this show before we'd met, but then it became really interesting to think about it in the context of the exhibition when we did meet, because there were all these ways in which this project combined. I think part of the reason why it was so popular is that it combined, you know, these two desires, this desire for sort of notoriety and participation in the culture at large through social media kinds of networking and exhibitionism, and at the same time this interest in privacy, which I think increasingly lots of news stories seem to cover. Kids who find themselves, recent college graduates who've gone all the way through college on Facebook and now find themselves struggling in an economy like this one to get job interviews when people can find all kinds of bad drinking pictures about them online, and are kind of trying to manage their digital lives differently.
Yeah, well, then there was an inherent irony in the whole thing, in that the whole idea was supposed to be that I'm disappearing, that I'm showing what it's like to disappear, and yet every day I had this surreal experience where I could get online and there were thousands of people talking about me and talking about who were my friends, and look at this new picture of him, and I found a video of him. So it was also the ultimate exposure in a way, at the same time that the whole point was supposed to be, you know, disappearing. It was the opposite effect was taking place.
I mean, did you do anything differently? Did you modify your behavior or sort of digital lifestyle or any other aspect of it after this was over?
No, to be honest, I didn't really. You know, I tightened up my Facebook privacy settings and the kinds of things that people do. But for me, it's too late. I mean, all the stuff's out there. It's still all out there. You know, you can find my signature on the apartment that I bought. You know, everything is posted online. I just had to rely in the end on the fact that once the contest was over, people could care less about me or my information. So it didn't really, besides being weird, it didn't really seem to change my life much once it's over. But no, I'm a little more careful, but I think you have to make almost a holistic decision whether you want to join that world or not. I mean, as you're saying, with not being on Facebook or not being on Twitter, you can do partial measures, but then you're relying on the companies to sort of, their goodwill that they're going to help you, and they have no interest in helping you maintain your privacy. So the easiest way to maintain your privacy is not to join. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the strange thing for me is to find periodically that I'm actually on Facebook, even without having a Facebook account. That there are pictures of me sometimes that other people post from a party or something and then tag afterwards and tag them to me so that somehow, I'm still there, which is kind of bizarre. It's a weird way in which kind of socially now we've almost been trained to surveil each other in this, under the guise of kind of fun or networking or this benign sharing of information, where we find ourselves kind of mimicking what the government's doing in a certain way, though we don't even know what the government's doing. But I just think it's fascinating that in the last decade we've essentially seen this collapse between the kind of state security apparatus on one hand and then the sort of entertainment digital culture apparatus on the other, that now sort of they work sometimes in tandem, as your project pointed out, and then sometimes independently. But I mean, you were saying before that you went and gave a presentation at the CIA. I mean, what are they? Did you ever ask them what they were interested in?
I did. I asked them many times. So I got invited to come speak to the CIA at CIA headquarters at a conference that they have, and at first I thought it was a joke. Actually, I thought someone was, partly because the CIA acts in really bizarre ways. Like they would only send me things in unmarked envelopes typed on an actual typewriter. And so it looked like someone was playing a joke on me, but it turned out they did want me to come speak, and I kept asking, like, what did you... And a lot of them, what they said was that they had a challenge which is related to the challenge that I had in this, which is that when they have agents go overseas and they need an identity, that in the old days you could kind of give them a fake business, you could give them a name and business cards, as I had, and they could kind of go with it. But now, because of database technology, you can run a background check on someone for $25, and that background check will get things like every address they've ever lived at, their credit history, all of that stuff exists. So what they call the backstop for the identity has to be much deeper than it used to be. Now, whether they didn't learn anything from me about how to do that. I think it was more because I had thought about the same issues. They had some database experts who spoke at the same time who actually really did have advice on those topics, but I had no advice to share on how they could improve their identities.
But so it's weirdly easier, it sounds like, and we've talked about this before, to steal someone else's identity than to try and create a fictional one.
Yeah, I mean, it all partly depends on what side of the law you want to be on. So, if in my case, if I wanted to buy a fake passport, if I wanted to go online and get into a social security number market and buy a social security number, those things are possible online. But in terms of establishing a new identity, especially if someone's looking for you, it's so much harder than it used to be, because as much as there's some anonymity online, in the real world, it's much harder to have anonymity than it ever was. And you can get online and go into a forum and be anonymous, or go into Second Life or whatever you want. But in your real life, you need ID for everything. You need a social security number for everything. And to your point about the way that sort of like surveillance has merged with Hollywood and social networking and all these things. I had investigators, U.S. Marshals and private investigators who specialize in looking for people, who said, 20, 30 years ago, it would take us months to gather what we can gather in 5 minutes or less on Facebook. If we want to find someone, we would have to build up a profile about them. And what you've done is you've actually built up a profile about yourself. And and it goes even farther than that, the FBI and U.S. Marshals and Secret Service, they have fake profiles on Facebook, and they use them to catch people. They use them to lure people into conversations and to give away their location.
Yeah, I mean, the best version of that in reverse, I thought, was the crashing of the White House state dinner by that couple who wanted to have a reality show and somehow infiltrated state security in an effort to and took pictures and then posted them online of themselves inside the barriers supposedly maintained by the government to protect the president.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
sort
I
of
guess showing that even though, as much as they have more access to tools, it doesn't mean they're not bumbling.
Right. Maybe we should open it up for questions. People have questions? I think there are microphones around, so that everyone can hear it.
Like this exhibit is called Minneapolis in Winter.
I know, it's really cold.
It's so cold up here.
Hey, Evan, I read your article when it came out in Wired, and I was wondering, towards the end, when you were getting really paranoid, like around the time of the helicopter thing, did you almost find yourself kind of subconsciously wanting to be caught just to be over with it?
Well, I didn't. The helicopter thing actually happened at the end of the first week. So that kind of paranoia built up when I realized how many people were paying attention to it. Because remember, when we started it, we didn't have any idea if 5 people or 100 or 1,000 were actually going to care. And is $5,000 a lot for this kind of thing or not? So when I realized how many people were paying attention, I got pretty paranoid, and that's when I ran from the helicopter. But at that point, I did not. I really, really did not want to get caught because, first of all, it would be embarrassing to get caught after anything less than 2 weeks. And also, I had kind of put a lot of people through a lot of minor trauma to do this. My family was worried about what was going to happen. I left my girlfriend behind for a month, and we were moving. And, these were things that I wanted to try to push it as far as I could and not have wasted everyone's sort of emotional energy to do it. But by the end, I think I actually kind of fell off my paranoia partly because I had been worn down. I remember I was riding a train from, I think, New Orleans to Memphis, and there was a guy sitting there, and he kept looking over at me. And I just thought, this guy knows who I am. He recognizes me. And then he got off at the next stop. And then I started thinking, what am I doing? Like, not everyone knows about this stupid contest. It's my entire world, but it's not everyone else's world. So I think within that was this idea of like, I did just kind of want it to be over at a certain point. But then
that's also how you got caught.
That's partly how I got caught. But even when I got caught, I was angry though, because as I got closer to the end, there was only 4 days left. So
and the $5,000 looked closer.
Yeah, exactly. And I may or may not have mentioned, but $3,000 of the $5,000 I put up for it. So that was my incentive to not get caught. Was I was going to lose $3,000. So you can imagine when I actually finally did get caught, and these guys are like jumping up and down and dancing around because they've just won $5,000, and I'm sitting there having lost $3,000, and then they took me out and bought me a pizza.
Gluten-free.
Yeah.
Another question up there.
Yeah, my question is, did you consider not inventing another identity for online? I mean, it would seem to me that if you wanted truly not to be found, you'd stay away from the internet entirely. But that wasn't your challenge, I gather.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. If you want to avoid being caught by your IP address, for example, you do not go online. I mean, that is the best thing for you to do. But at the same time, if you think about, it's one thing to think about escaping for a month, but if you think about trying to start over in your life, you're saying you're not going to go online, for the indefinite future. And my thought was, well, if I actually did want to abandon my life in the manner of someone who, let's say, fakes their own death, I wouldn't want to start over as a hermit. I like being online. I like using email. I like these things. So I wanted to see what the challenge would be if I did continue to use them, if I lived a life that was sort of parallel to my own, but with a different name.
This is a question for Evan. What did you expect to be difficult but found to be easy?
I think that, think about that. I thought would be difficult and easy. I mean, the getting around was easier than I expected, partly because, I had a problem at first because I wanted to take Amtrak a lot, but Amtrak has an ID requirement. I didn't realize it had an ID requirement, but then that was really scary at first. But then I realized how, paper thin that requirement actually is, where no one's ever really paying attention. It's like this habitual security measure that if you think about it, it doesn't really even accomplish anything. Like anyone can have an ID, and the fact that I show you an ID doesn't tell you anything about what I'm going to do or anything. So once I realized that they weren't really paying attention and that I could kind of talk my way around it wherever I went, then taking Amtrak, even though they asked for ID, it was easy. And also, it was surprisingly easy. I thought it was going to be a problem to convince people that I was who I said I was. And that's why I had all this, elaborate setup of web pages and Facebook accounts and all that sort of thing. But, people are pretty trusting. And they're not automatically suspicious of you. So even though oftentimes I was doing sort of weird things, the band that I hitched a ride with, they wondered, and they told me later they did wonder, what is this guy doing? Like, why is he going across the country? He seems to have no purpose. He's like too old for this, and also his goatee's died. Like, what is he trying to like relive his youth or something? But it didn't seem like I was doing any harm. So, and everyone I encountered, they had a sort of natural trust that I guess if I thought about it, it makes sense. You don't automatically assume someone's giving you a fake name. But then later, I felt really guilty about it. So I actually went back and I had to apologize to everyone that I had interacted with over the course of a month that I could find. Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny. I mean, people are trusting in part because you're a white guy who looks like a generic American in a certain way.
Well, that was a whole other part of it, which, for better or worse, is not the genre of sort of Wired magazine topics. But, I mean, of course, like the easiest way to disappear in America is to be marginalized and part of a marginalized community. Like, right. It's almost like a foreign notion to someone that you should try to disappear when you're sort of already feeling like right. You have no resources, no one's paying attention. So, and that also carried over into I could talk my way into doing things and being places where people weren't suspicious of me just because of the way I look or the way
right.
I was dressed.
Was that part of the reason why that Te Ching Se piece was I thought was so great, because here's a guy who's sort of performing his invisibility as a work of art in a certain way. But anyway. There's another question up there.
All right, well, two questions. The first one's dumb. What was the name of the band? And the second one is you said people were trying to formulate ideas and things about where you're going and what you're doing. What were some of the wilder, more outlandish theories?
So the name of the band is the Hermit Thrushes. They're from Philadelphia. They're a really small band, but they're really great. They play kind of like art rock, as they called it, like indie rock, but very experimental. They were fun. They would play bars with just 2 or 3 people in like Lubbock, Texas, and then take off their shirts and their pants and like dance around. It was fun stuff.
And you've talked to them since the article came out?
Yes. Not only have I talked to them, I went to see one of their shows in Brooklyn, and then they invited me to come on tour with them again. And so the wilder theories, I mean, it was wild in terms of the way that they would think I was somewhere. And it was interesting how the information that was totally unverified people would start to gather around it. So if someone would start a rumor that I was in Seattle, then other people would feed off of it, and then other people who entered the conversation later would not realize that it was based on a completely unfounded piece of information, and then they would sort of start, putting up flyers and doing things like that. I think the big theory the prevailing theory for the better part of 3 or 4 days was that I was in Hawaii, and I had previously lived in Hawaii, and so that made some sense. But they had this theory that I had taken a cruise ship to Hawaii, which was remarkable to me because I'd actually considered the possibility of doing that. But if anyone bothered to look it up, the time it takes to get to Hawaii in a cruise ship would not account for the time that elapsed. And eventually someone said, wait, this is not possible. They'd already skipped that step. And they were already looking at places in Hawaii where I might be, and which island is he on, and is he in the old place where he lived before, and things like that. So, yeah, that was probably the furthest afield.
Sometime before your article was in Wired magazine, there was a large spread in Wired about the disappearance of Jim Gray, the Microsoft scientist. In any way, did his disappearance inspire your project?
I mean, not in any conscious, excuse me, not in any conscious way that I can think of. That was a great piece, and that was a tragic story. But his was a case of lost at sea. And the interesting thing in that case, and why it made such a compelling story, was that he was a high tech guy, and he had all these friends in high tech, and they basically employed every possible resource that they could bring to bear on it, and they still couldn't find him. So I don't know, maybe it did. I think I'd been collecting these fake death stories for years and years, so I was already sort of looking for an end. But it certainly may have given my editors, a reason to accept it.
I'm wondering about the stories that you told people about this new identity, and if that was fun. Did you make up anything about your college experience, or like what was the small talk like when you were interacting, meeting people at bars or something like that? Was it hard to keep it straight too?
It was hard to keep it straight, and I will say that I thought that would be fun, and it was not. It absolutely was not fun. Partly because it's nerve-wracking. I mean, I commend you to try this. Like, try to go introduce yourself to someone, even just using a different name. It feels like such a fundamental deception because you're so used to introducing yourself as yourself, telling your story, reaching back into your memory to make connections. Oh, I've been to Minneapolis. I came through here when I was driving across the country. And then to try to shut all that down and make things up. It's fun when you're sitting at home doing it and saying, I was developing backstories. And, I'll say that I went to school here. And I would always use things that I had knowledge of so that if someone challenged me, oh, my brother went to Georgia Tech, then I would say, oh, well, yeah, what dorm was he in? And I had some knowledge about it, even though I didn't go there. But when I actually had to tell people these stories, I couldn't really connect with them because at a certain point, I didn't really want to talk about myself, and I didn't want to respond in the way that you would normally respond to people. I wanted to shut the conversation down and move it in another direction or make them talk about themselves. So it ended up being, I was having such superficial relationships with the people that I was encountering. Even though, naturally I was just meeting them, so it would be superficial anyway, but even beyond that, it was sort of like, it wasn't real, and it felt, guilty.
This one right there.
Hello. As you talked, the one thing that kind of thought back on is when the Unabomber case was going on. It was really when they started turning evidence over to the public and having people could look at his handwriting, and when that manifesto came out and his brother read it and said, this is his writing style, this is him. You see, like going to see the CIA, I really see more of the FBI being able to turn evidence like that over to the general public. And has anybody ever talked to you about something like that?
Yeah, well, certainly several investigators told me that the best investigative tool that's evolved over the last 10 or 20 years is America's Most Wanted. The U.S. Marshals will tell you that. They have pretty good resources. They're incredibly good at finding people, fugitives on the run, but it's a whole different thing when you can put their picture on TV and details about them, manipulated pictures of what they might look like now, and then put it out to millions of people. And then afterwards, there were some ideas that the people who had, especially the core of people who had worked so hard to find me and were really, really good at it and had turned up so many clues, they would get together and sort of develop a website that would help find actual missing people, which was it was actually kind of a source of embarrassment for part of it. People are putting up flyers about me, and they're actually real missing people who aren't getting the same resources, and I think they felt the same way. But the problem is always, investigators, government investigators, they don't want to give away that information until they're absolutely the most desperate to find someone. So, they'll do the wanted poster and things like that, but they don't actually want to give away that investigative material. In the Unabomber case, that was years and years after they were just completely desperate, and it was fruitless. They weren't able to find this guy that they thought, well, let's just try this. Anyone else?
There's one back there.
Hi, I was just wondering if, like how successful people were at actually finding information about you. I mean, like you mentioned that they found like your IP address in Las Vegas, but I was just wondering if there was other activities that you were doing that they did discover about.
They were more successful at digging up information that already existed than they were actually, finding out day-to-day information about me. Because until someone knew my fake name, that was incredibly difficult. Because I could be doing anything. I could be on any website. It could be anywhere. But they were excellent at digging up every single bit of information from every crevice that could be gleaned online or through databases that investigators can access, through public documents, whether real estate records or driver's license. They found out that I got a motorcycle license recently, before I left and things like that. But it wasn't until really Jeff Reifman was the first person to kind of make a connection to my new identity. So to actually dig up a piece of information about where I was right then. And that was obviously the key to my undoing. I was careful that I didn't tell anyone, including my girlfriend who I live with, where I was going or what I was doing. I didn't even leave a hint. But you could sort of see how through interviews, and the editors at Wired were interviewing my friends and posting interviews online, that they could start to paint a picture. And one friend of mine even said, I bet he's in New Orleans, just because we grew up together in Atlanta. We had been to New Orleans as kids, and he thought, well, that seems like a natural place for him to go. So, my point is that the information from my past eventually would coalesce into something that would probably help him find me. A month wasn't long enough for that to really help, so it really took someone making the connection through, finding my IP address and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Hi, Evan.
Hi.
Hindsight being 2020, is there anything you would have done differently those last couple days that you look back and say, God, if I only would have done this, like looked across that park before you went to the pizza place or something like that? Anything jump out at you like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one, there was one single moment actually, which is when the first time I accessed that page on Facebook that Jeff Reifman created. I can distinctly remember making the decision to not go through my Vegas office, not use the Tor software to hide my IP address, thinking, look, I'm just accessing Facebook. So unless somebody who works at Facebook is like going to steal my IP and then give it out to the public, which frankly I probably should have been worried about as well, but I thought, well, that's relatively unlikely. I thought, I can't be bothered with all this anymore. I'm just going to go check this page and see what people are saying. So that moment right there, I would certainly change. And then overall, I think that I would probably try to change my location more quickly in the last week because I had spent so much time in New Orleans. It was sort of like, they were closing in around me. But again, it was this issue of if you're really going to do this, if you really had to disappear, eventually you want to land somewhere and live your life. And I was going to cafes, I was going to bars, I was having fun in New Orleans as much as I could. I had an apartment, and I didn't want to be on the run constantly because it's exhausting. So, but of course, if I really didn't want to get caught and I could look back now, I would have been out of there already. To a city with more than one gluten-free pizza place, probably.
I was wondering how you changed your life afterwards. For example, the prevalence of RFID chips that is coming out. People are volunteering to be implanted to be VIP members in clubs and have it put on their credit card and their room charge, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. As much as you would think that because I did this that I have strong feelings about privacy and that sort of thing, I don't, because what you have to do is you have to sit down and make the calculation. I think it's dumb to do things without actually reflecting on what they might mean for your privacy. But if I decide, I don't know if the club would be a good example for me, but if I decide that convenience is worth it for me, that if some club knows my information or even, my date of birth, then maybe I don't care. And maybe it's worth it to me. And if I want to make that decision, fine. And if you do, then you got to hope that a lot of people make that decision, because there's a sort of strength in numbers in the fact that everyone's doing this and there's so much information that, yours is sort of less important in the grand scheme of things. And, I don't like to be marketed to. I don't like people knowing things about me. But at the same time, I recognize that a lot of things I do when I go order a book online or whatever, I do it because I'm making a choice for convenience. So I suppose I do worry about it, but I don't, like many people, I don't act on it. But I try to at least each time say, well, is this worth it to me?
And there are also things that you can't do anything about, like, I had to get a new passport last year, and anyone who, I don't know, I guess it's been about 2 years, 3 years, anyone who gets a new passport now, there's a microchip embedded in the passport that has your information in it. And there's if you want to travel as an American citizen, there's nothing that you can do to avoid that. You can't opt out of it. The government has it. I mean, I was thinking today in the airport, the TSA has been trying a new system to monitor the length of security lines by capturing the sort of IP address-like thing that your cell phone admits, and using that to kind of track how long you're waiting in line as you pass through the system. Of course, that's what they say that it's for. It used to just be that you could come out and look at how long the line was and then put more people on. But you could turn your phone off. There are certain things but to Evan's point, you have to do more and more things that are inconvenient to try and kind of insulate yourself from those kinds of things. And I was having this thought while I was walking past this whole bank of IBM ads, which probably a lot of people have seen, that are sort of, I think, called the Smarter Planet ad campaign that they're running. It says, like, rivers will tell you when they're going to flood, or all these things, this idea that information can be used productively to improve the world. One of the sort of things in the ad campaign, it says, how do we use information? Consumers these days tell us what they want. And the idea of this sort of implicit pronoun of us, as if like we're telling companies what it is that we want, essentially we just have to realize, I think, that is how corporate America sees the information that we volunteer, as a communication that can be used as a resource for them, the same way government or investigators can, to tailor products to us, which I think is kind of fascinating.
Well, it's also funny that people, if you took the sort of most dystopian science fiction scenario and said, what if we all had a chip embedded in us that had a distinct number that said where we were at all times? Right. That's your cell phone.
Right.
Your cell phone, and even people, one of the other speakers at the CIA said this. He said, the cell phone is the ultimate identity tracker, because there's lots of databases that say who you are, your date of birth, and all these things, but the cell phone is the one thing that has a unique identifier that's always with you all the time. So it can verify your location in addition to your identity. Now, you can give someone else your cell phone and throw them off, but most people don't do that. Most people are using their cell phone. So if you really want privacy, you probably shouldn't be carrying around something that's a unique geographic locator to your exact position that can be uncovered by almost anyone, including not just a government investigator. In fact, I'm doing another story now that involves a private investigator. So it's just a PI. He doesn't have any special powers. All he has is his own investigative skills. And he will get people's cell phone information by walking into a Sprint store, for example, and saying, hey, I need these records from this cell phone. And just like with those phone calls, the first clerk will say, well, are you this person? And he'll say, no, I'm not this person. I'm an investigator. I'm a private investigator. And they'll say, oh, well, I can't give you that. And then he'll go to the next store 2 blocks away. And eventually, one of the clerks will say, oh, you're a private investigator? Oh, I must be able to give you this information. We'll print out the bill and hand it to him. It's totally legal.
Right. Amazing. Probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Oh, sorry, there's one right here.
Evan, it's like 3 things. Did you use phones at all? And how was this emotionally for you for a month? Like, was it frazzling? And then also, was there any contingency plan, like if you got in a car accident or something really bad happened, where you would reveal your identity for like health reasons besides gluten-free products?
So
Phones.
I did. I used prepaid phones. I never used my own cell phone. As a matter of fact, the very first thing I did when I left was I took the battery out of my cell phone, because your cell phone's actually potentially trackable even if it's not on, if the battery's in it. So I took the battery out of my cell phone and it never went back in. So I used prepaid phones, which are also traceable. If someone knows the number, they can trace them. So I used 3 or 4. I would dump them periodically if I thought that the number had, become public. So the second one was emotionally, it was very up and down. It was a very weird experience, obviously, and it was very isolating because I wasn't communicating with people, my friends and my family. So things like being really paranoid, I didn't have anyone around to say, you're acting like an idiot, or no one's really flying a helicopter looking for you. I was in my own, really inside my own internal world, and that that created a lot of sort of freakouts that in your normal life probably wouldn't happen. And then the third thing was for emergencies. Well, a couple things. I tried to carry my real ID with me everywhere I went, like if I went jogging or something, so that I didn't want to get hit by a car and then end up in a hospital and be sort of like John Doe somewhere in America. And then my family actually, so I wanted to give my family a way to contact me in case they had an emergency or they needed to get in touch with me. And so I mailed them a prepaid phone. And that prepaid phone was programmed with one number, which was the number for one prepaid phone that I had. So these were the only 2 phones that would interact. They were paid for with cash. I put a note in there to my parents saying, if anything happens, use this phone to call my phone. The day that I left, we did have a family emergency of sorts. My mom called my prepaid phone from her real cell phone. So, even my carefully laid plans were, and I dumped that phone after the first day. So actually, after the first day, they had no way to contact me. But the weird thing was they were actually really worried about my safety, and that ended up being not a concern at all, partly because it was so oddly public, the whole thing, that, it just, there wasn't an issue of sort of like something happening to me, someone coming after me or something like that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if Stephen King's, I'm right here.
Oh, there
Stephen King's 1970s book, The Running Man, had any influence on?
It didn't, because I have not actually read it, but I'm aware that it's deeply relevant, but I haven't read it.
It makes sense because it does kind of bring out a lot of the paranoia stuff, and possibly if you've read it, you may have chose not to do it. I mean, that kind of a book.
Well, I'm not sure then if it's good or bad that I haven't read it, but yeah, it's probably good because it might have deterred me.
Well, it seems like a good place to end. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks a lot.